Moving on, Syria air defenses have intercepted missiles fired from the direction of the occupied territories at Damascus countryside. Mohammed Ali is our correspondent who joins us now to explain more about what has occurred. Mohammed, over to you.
It has been confirmed that it was an Israeli attack that hit Damascus countryside at 11:17 a.m. Local time, according to an official military source. Israel launched an attack using surface-to-surface, ground-to-ground missiles, firing them from the northern parts of the occupied Palestinian territories on Damascus countryside. According to the official military source, Syria's air defenses were able to intercept the enemy missiles, shoot down some of them. However, other missiles seem to have hit their targets, and the attack led to the injury of 2 Syrian army soldiers and also caused some material damage. Reports say that the attack targeted a Syrian army position in El Dimas area. This is according to reports, of course, but officially speaking, an official military source confirmed the news. It was an Israeli attack. It's not the first, definitely, and it happened just about an hour ago.
Are there any Russian contingents or personnel in any vicinity of any of these attacks that happened?
Well, it doesn't seem so, because so far we did not hear any statement or any such kind of news coming out from the Russian side. We only know that 2 Syrian army soldiers have been injured as a result, and some material damages were caused. Usually those Israeli attacks target Syrian army bases and positions, whether it's in Damascus or around it, sometimes in central Syria. And the way that the attack happens varies, sometimes from the occupied territories, sometimes Israel violates Lebanese airspace or Syrian airspace. And the Syrian Foreign Ministry usually always sends letters to the UN condemning such an attack and calling on the international body to shoulder its responsibility in doing something, in preserving international peace and security and stopping Israel and forcing it to respect the sovereignty of states and the UN relevant resolutions and, of course, international law. But so far, nothing, of course, has been done internationally speaking by the international community, and Israeli strikes and attacks continue almost every week or two on Damascus since the start of the crisis.
Latest news, Syria. Islamic State militants stepping up attacks in eastern central Syria. Israel launches missile attacks near Syria's Damascus. And why did the Israeli military assassinate Midhat Saleh? This is the latest news. VOA News, dated November 3rd, 2021. Headliner: Islamic State militants stepping up attacks in eastern and central Syria. According to local reports, militants linked to the Islamic State terror group have stepped up their attacks in eastern and central Syria in recent days. The local North Press agency reports that at least 2 Syrian government soldiers were killed Monday in an attack carried out by suspected ISIS fighters near the ancient town of Palmyra in central Syria. The militants reportedly targeted a checkpoint guarded by Syrian army soldiers from the 4th Division, concealing themselves behind a seized military vehicle. Local news reports say at least 7 Syrian government soldiers and Iranian-backed militiamen were killed 2 days prior in a separate attack by the Islamic State in eastern Syria. ISIS militants continue to undertake massive attacks against their opponents in Syria and Iraq, despite losing nearly all of their land they once controlled. The group has been particularly active in Syria's Bandia Desert, which is controlled by government forces, Iranian and Russian-backed militias in central Syria. Russia and Iran are 2 main supporters of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's government. The Bandia is a very interesting area in Syria right now, says Rami Abdulrahman, director of the Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. He also went on to say to VOA News, it connects regime-held areas to those controlled by Turkish-backed groups in parts of northern and western Syria. And so Islamic State militants can roam between the 2 areas and manage to avoid Russian airstrikes. In response to increasing Islamic State activity in the area, Russian planes on Monday carried out at least 15 airstrikes against hideouts believed to be belonging to the militants, according to the Syrian Observatory. Omar Abu Layla heads the El Azur, a journalism and research group focused on developments in eastern Syria. Abu Layla says the current acceleration of Islamic State strikes is a result of two factors. He went on to tell the VOA News, the first one is merely an attempt to boost the morale of its fighters and to show its supporters that the group is still capable of conducting deadly operations against any opposing force. The other factor is that they tried to end the nearly absolute sway of Iranian forces on the military supply line that stretches from the Iraqi border all the way to Skayrat Air Base in Homs province and other areas in Syria. Islamic State also has active cells in some areas under the control of the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces in eastern Syria, particularly Deir el-Zor province. In October, 21 anti-Islamic State operations were carried out by the Syrian Defense Force, the group said Monday. The operation, supported by the U.S.-led coalition troops, resulted in the arrest of 51 suspected ISIS fighters. These joint operations demonstrate our mutual commitment as partners to deny Daesh any presence to influence in northern Syria, the coalition said on Twitter. Al Jazeera headliner, Israel launches missile attack near Syria's Damascus. Dated November 3rd, 2021. Israel has launched an aerial attack with a number of missiles targeting an area on the outskirts of the Syrian capital of Damascus, Syrian State TV said early on Wednesday, citing a military source. Syrian state news agency Sana confirmed the raids and said they caused only material damage. The Israeli enemy launched an aerial aggression with a number of missiles, the news agency said. There was no immediate comment from Israeli officials. The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the targets were army positions and arms depots belonging to Iranian-backed fighters. Last Saturday, Israel also fired missiles towards the suburbs of the Syrian capital, although they were intercepted by Syria's air defenses. On October 14th, an Israeli air raid on Iranian positions in central Syria also killed 9 fighters allied to the Syrian government. The attacks came days after Syria accused Israel of carrying out an attack in the country's south. Israel is alarmed by Iran's growing regional influence and military presence in Syria and has launched hundreds of attacks in Syria over the years, but rarely acknowledges or discusses such operations. The attacks in Syria usually happen during the night. Israel has also acknowledged it is targeting bases, weapons convoys, and facilities linked to Iran-allied militias, such as the powerful Lebanese Hezbollah group. It is also targeting arms shipments believed to be bound for the group. Hezbollah is fighting on the side of President Bashar al-Assad's forces in the civil war against the Islamic State and affiliated Sunni militants. The death of a former Syrian Druze lawmaker, Midhat Saleh, who was fatally shot on October 16th in Indeltina, a village along the Israeli frontier in the occupied Golan Heights, where he ran a government's office, the Syrian state news agency also said. The Israeli military declined to comment, but it is reported to the Israeli media that Saleh had been allegedly assisting the Iranian military against Israel. Israel had said it will not tolerate a permanent Iranian military presence in Syria and has acknowledged carrying out scores of air attacks on alleged Iranian armed shipments and military targets in Syria in recent years. However, there was no evidence to support that Saleh had ever been assisting the Iranian military against Israel. Israel had captured the Golan Heights from Syria in the 1967 Middle East War and later annexed the strategic territory which overlooks northern Israel. Most of the world does not recognize the annexation, though the administration of former U.S. President Donald Trump declared the territory to be part of Israel. Saleh was born in Majd Shams in the Israeli-controlled side of the Golan and was jailed several times by Israel, most recently for 12 years until 1997. He later moved to Syria, was elected to its parliament in 1998, and served as an advisor to the government on the Golan issue. The small Jewish community living in the Israeli-controlled side of the Golan generally had good relations with Israel, but many members still profess loyalty to Syria, in part because they have relatives on the other side. That's the latest news. Now, my thoughts. There seems to be a repeating pattern. Back in 2001, just days after the 9/11 attacks, it was the United States and Israel who implicated the Baathists in Iraq of supporting al-Qaeda and manufacturing biological and chemical weapons. Those turn out to be demonstrably false. Then in 2006, the Israeli military, the IDF, was soundly defeated by Hezbollah in 2006, creating an embarrassment to the Israeli military, which still hasn't let go after a 34-day military conflict in Lebanon. Then the Arab Spring, which of course afflicted many of the Arab countries, incidentally, those who were deemed enemies to the United States, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and Israel. Countries were decimated behind these revolutions, such as Syria, Libya, the problem stems from the fact that these are wars of attrition and the extension of the neocon, dual Israeli neocon governments, which basically switch between the Republican and Democratic parties, for they hold no allegiance except to the agendas in which they outlined years ago. After the Arab Springs, we saw the war in Syria, which was a fight against the Syrian government under Bashar al-Assad and the Sunni militants. However, it was later reported, and also later to be found due to historical fact from multiple human rights agencies, including the legacy media to an extent because of whistleblowers, that the United States government had outlined a plan to support the militants in Syria to help overthrow the Assad government. It was supported by none other than King Abdullah II in Jordan, and also the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, which was authorized by former CIA Director General David Petraeus. Obama, then the US president, first declined the operation, but then accepted it due to pressure, most notably from the Gulf and Israel, the two most powerful lobbies, foreign lobbies in our government current today. And then, of course, a 2015 report in which Israel was treating al-Qaeda fighters wounded in Syria. The Nusra Front, the al-Nusra Front, a Sunni Muslim offshoot, al-Qaeda offshoot, which were fighting the Iranian-backed axis of Bashar al-Assad and Hezbollah in Syria. In which Hezbollah and the Persians and the Russians We're really fighting the real war on terror, which are the Sunni jihadist militants backed, and unfortunately to say, but this is a reality, by the United States secret government and its CIA proxies, as well as the Gulf and Israel. And according to Amos Yadlin, the former military intelligence chief, who is currently running to be the defense minister, in 2015 told the Jerusalem Post that Hezbollah and Iran are the major threats to Israel, much more than the radical Sunni Islamists who are also an enemy. Now you tell me, it's not Hezbollah who attacked the United States on September 11, 2001. It wasn't Iran that funded the hijackers to come inside the United States, supported by an Iranian base here in the United States. Those were Saudi agents, as well as Israeli agents. It wasn't Hezbollah who blew up the Khobar Towers. It wasn't Iran who blew up the USS Cole. It wasn't Iran who car-bombed U.S. coalition troops in Iraq in 2003. These were all Sunni jihadist Salafist groups. The only reason why Israel and the United States continue to press the issue that Hezbollah is the greater threat to regional stability is the reason because these countries like the United States, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, which is the Gulf, are all covertly supporting these Islamic Salafist groups to overthrow these anti-Western governments for fear of a true united Islamic caliphate, which isn't going to be run by the jihadists, but by a true Arab democracy. This was outlined in the Oded Yanon Plan in 1986, as well as Paul Wolfowitz Doctrine, which later became the Bush Doctrine, under the neocons and the ghoulish Wahhabi Gulf ghosts, as well as the draconian and bloodthirsty Zionists in Israel. All three are the real true axis of evil and behind in carrying out and supporting these militants and these Arab governments who are trying to fight and stave off not just one, but multiple enemies and governments. And it's high time the American people have a say in what is happening in our name and put a stop to it.